I'm thrilled to be joined today by Phil Brandt, Bondo Phil, a modeler of some reputation who has a great fondness for jets of this era. Phil, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, James. We haven't figured out yet what that reputation is, but I'll attempt to hold my end up. I've always loved the 107. I think it's extremely sleek. Even in today's market, it looks as good as anything out there, and I'm pleased to be able to talk about it.
Well, great. Well, tell us a little bit about your background and how you became to be a model builder and your interest in aircraft.
I started at the age of 6. I just liked airplanes. My brothers and I liked airplanes. I built my first model at 6.
What was that model?
It was one of those paper airplanes, printed on paper, like a cardstock airplane, which they did produce back in the late 40s.
Right.
My parents got me
Careful,
one.
you're dating yourself there.
Right. Well, I was born in 1938, so I worked on that, and then I moved from that to stick models and tissue paper and glue, and I can remember making some horrible projects with that, but I did it.
Flying models?
Eventually. The first ones didn't fly real well, but as I got into 10, 11, 12 years old, then I started doing free flights and later did a little radio control and did a lot of control line with my brothers where we would take a fuel-soaked older model and pour gasoline on the tail, light it, and take it off, and it would just disintegrate in the air on its final flight, Viking type burial.
A Viking aircraft.
That's
Great.
right.
Yeah, none of us have ever done that before.
Right. Well,
how'd you get into plastic modeling?
I was a senior in college, frankly, and I was a little bored at one point while I was flunking so many chemistry courses. But anyhow, I started building a bunch of the older Revell S kits and just started there, and it just took off. And later when I entered the Air Force and was stationed in Japan, the Japanese made a lot of models, as they do today, and I was just able to take off with it and keep building models in Japan.
What did you do while you were in the Air Force?
I was a ground pounder in communications for the first 3 years because I had been told in ROTC that my eyes didn't qualify me for flying status, and I just bought it at that point. But when Vietnam heated up, I went into the flight surgeon, and they checked my eyes again, and miracle of miracles, all of a sudden I met the qualifications in 1965, and this was in Fuchu, Japan. And 6 months later, my wife and family and I were in Sacramento, California in the middle of the 60s. Things were really rolling along, and I was in navigator school. I then, after graduation, I went to Military Airlift Command, which we know as MAC, knew as MAC back then. Flew the heavies, C-124s, world's largest three-engine airplane, we call it. And then volunteered to move into C-133s, which was a whole new ball game. A lot of people don't even know what the airplane was. They'll say, and other people will say to me, "What? You were in 133s and you're still alive?" Because we lost a bunch of them in those years. But yes, but I had always wanted to be in fast movers. My mind said, "Be safe, be alive, fly transports," but my heart said, "Go to fighters," like my younger brother who was a fighter pilot. I volunteered for reconnaissance, went to RF-4s, and later into F-111s for 9 years.
Wow.
And then I retired flying a gray steel desk at Bergstrom Air Force Base. Like so, we all know the way the career progression goes.
Now, Phil, you were sharing a story with me earlier about transporting some museum aircraft during your time.
It was a very serendipitous event. We had just come back in our trusty C-133 from Southeast Asia. Our Southeast Asia, we call them turnarounds from Dover, Delaware, all the way to Saigon and back. Would take maybe 10 days. And we had landed back at Travis Air Force Base in near San Francisco, and we were diverted by our command authorities down to Edwards Air Force Base, and that's all they said, go to Edwards Air Force Base. We flew down there, and lo and behold, it turned out we were going to carry one of the 2 remaining X-15s to the museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
The U.S. Air Force Museum.
The U.S. Air Force Museum. We got down there, and there was the X-15. The wings were off it, but it was sitting there, jet black, mean-looking. I even still have a picture of me standing with my hand on the cue ball nose. What we really wanted to do was each of us get into the seat and take each other's pictures with the canopy up like an astronaut in the seat of the X-15, but they had torn it apart and had all this extraneous plumbing and all type of equipment which totally filled up the cockpit. There was no way you could sit in it, so we had to be satisfied with the exterior pictures. We flew it to Wright-Patterson in Dayton, and lost an engine on approach, and they were very concerned about that. Were we going to crash with their X-15, which we did not. But we did get a VIP tour because we had brought them the X-15. I got to go up in the cockpit of the XB-70 before anyone else.
Wow.
No museum visitors were allowed. That was when it was still parked outside in a gravel parking lot. They took us up inside, and as I was inside the cockpit, I saw there's a steering wheel bezel, just like on a car, in the center of the steering wheel, and it said B-70. And I thought to myself, if I just had a screwdriver, I could get this off, and I'll be the only person in the world with a B-70.
Driving a B-70.
Driving a B-70 or in my home. And then I thought, but my career will also be over for ripping off a piece of government property, so I didn't do it.
Your wiser instincts took over there.
That is correct. So then, a few months later, we were again coming back from Southeast Asia. This was just luck of the draw, and again we're diverted to south to Edwards Air Force Base. This time we picked up the number 1 ship, the original X-15, the shorter one, and we took it to the Smithsonian.
I understand there are a couple aircraft at Wright, Pat, that you had the pleasure of flying.
Yes, there are 2 133s there. There may only be one left now, but 40143 and ever popular 62008, better known as Balls 8, were both there. They were back in the, one of them was out on the flight line in front, and it held the world's record at one time for a heavy lift. And the other one is back in the back. We used to call it, I believe, Area C, where you used to be able to walk back or drive back. They were airplanes that were not on prime display, but they were still in nice shape, and you could walk all around them. So I was had my picture taken by my wife standing next to the airplane, which I had actually navigated.
Now, one of the other aircraft in one of the back hangars there is one of the prototype F-107A aircraft. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, and that got my attention right away when I was there, and I still have a whole series of photos I took at that time. I just was really enthralled by the looks of the airplane. And
it's a very sexy-looking airplane.
Oh, I think it is, definitely. People in the past have criticized the overhead intakes, but I just think it makes it look really sleek.
Now, I understand you're also familiar with the F-107 prototype that's located at the Pima Museum. Is that correct?
Yes, I've paid probably 5 visits over the last 20 years to Pima, and I've seen it in different states of repair or disrepair. I've seen it taken apart where they were painting it. Their funds are limited, and I understand there that they can't just move ahead as the Air Force Museum would. But yes, and it's there, and today it's completely together, no engine inside, no engine mounted, but it's all there. But once again, it's parked outside, and that sun just does terrible damage to paint, as we know. But it's there, and it's all together.
Now, Phil and I were just chatting a few moments ago. We knew where both of these prototypes were, but there was a third F-107A constructed. And Phil, why don't you talk a little bit about the disposition of that aircraft?
Well, I understand from the fairly recent book issued by Steve Ginter on the F-107 that the disposition of this was what happens to so many other, in my opinion, valuable aircraft. It was shipped out to a location somewhere, I believe, in the West and used for firefighting practice. And it probably only lasted a year. After they do so many fire practices, there's nothing left but a charred aluminum frame. And what a sad ending to a truly unusual airplane.
Phil, let's talk a little bit about the origins of the F-107A project, how it was a follow-on to the earlier F-86 and F-100 Saberlines.
Yes, well, one need merely look at the lines of the F-107, and you can see its very strong heredity from the very famous F-100 or Hun. The 107 went head-to-head with the Republic F-105, and it was a really serious duel. It was one of the very first fly-offs, if you will, at Edwards, and the 107 they were neck and neck with the F-105.
Now, what was the goal of this competition here?
To have a fighter-type aircraft that could at the same time be nuclear capable. And this, unfortunately, the design thoughts of North American were contrary to those of what the Air Force really wanted. I'm getting this, I don't know this personally, but I'm getting it from all the reading I have done. Republic built a very large weapons bay in the F-105, and it was able to upload and carry with no problem a nuclear weapon at low level, high speed. Although the one
that was an internal weapons bay,
that was
correct?
An internal weapons bay. The Republic understood what the Air Force wanted, and they gave them what they wanted. North America, and evidently there were a contingent of designers who thought, well, we can carry it externally. That'll be good enough because we have a very fast, capable airplane. Well, turned out that they didn't get the picture. The Air Force really did want a Bombay-type aircraft, and the 107 wasn't a Bombay-type aircraft, although flying-wise, it is my understanding, was every bit as good as the F-105. Of course, we know that the F-105 went on to acquit itself famously in North Vietnam, where it truly was a tough, fast airplane.
Phil, let's chat for a moment about some of the kits of the F-107A that are available.
All right, there are principally three. One is the very elderly air model conversion meant for the Hasegawa, also elderly, 172nd kit. But I built this kit in Thailand in 1975, and I still think it's an okay kit. Basically, they give you the vacuum-formed fuselage, shorn of any details, but you just combine it with the wings of the Hasegawa kit, and that's where you can see the heredity of the 107 from the F-100. The wings are essentially the same, and it worked out okay, but once again, we're talking modeling-wise ancient history. Then about 8 years ago, Collect Air brought out an all-resin kit of the F-107 in quarter-inch.
Quarter-inch, you mean 1/48 scale?
1/48 scale, correct. They brought it out. It's a solid fuselage, which makes for a very heavy chunk of resin, which I had to hog out over many hours with an automobile die grinder and a Dremel moto tool, but I did remove about a pound of resin. The molding, in my opinion, is excellent on this. It's as good as practically any injected kit out there today. They have various vendors, and apparently this was one of their better vendors who did this. I especially like the intake arrangement, the way the intake is multi-pieced together.
Tell us a little bit about the cockpit arrangement in this particular kit, Phil.
Well, the cockpit, the stock Collect Air kit, is somewhat plain. Not terrible, but somewhat plain. It's good from about 2 feet away, looks very nice. I elected instead to get the black box F-100 set, which is just outstanding. And since there's a very strong link between the airplanes, the F-100 and F-107, I reasoned that who would ever know that an F-100 interior properly modified was not the original F-107 cockpit.
Right.
And I went ahead and did that, and it made it very busy and really added some welcome detail to the assembly. There's an area behind the cockpit in the 107 which actually has windows and a lot of electronics boxes. I'm pretty much going to leave them stock the way Collect Air did them, but I'm going to add piping and some wiring because it also, other than for a few protrusions, is fairly plain.
Now, another area I noticed that could stand a little additional detail are the landing gear bays. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the landing gear wells also are rather plain, just a tiny bit of structural detail. But since you don't really see them once the gear doors are on, I do have photos from Pima and the Air Force Museum which do show all the wealth of equipment inside the bay. But since they're going to be covered and since they're low on the airplane, I'm just going to go with what Collect Air presented. It is in the wings of the F-107 where one can see the direct inheritance from the famous F-100. I still think that the monogram kit of 25 years ago is still a great kit. Yes, it's got raised paneling, but other than that, I think it's a wonderful kit. And I determined that I would use the movable slats on the monogram kit and adapt them to the Collect Air kit, which doesn't give you any flap or slat options.
Right.
I sliced off the leading edges of the monogram wings. Then I cut out the corresponding area of the all-resin Collect Air wings and simply grafted in the slats. And they just work like gangbusters. Then I removed the flaps in the F-107 wing and dremeled a round slot. I take the flap piece, once it is cut out, and I put a piece of half round I glue on the forward edge. Then I grind a small groove in the trailing area of the wing, and the flap goes in as if it was made that way.
Fits in as if it were designed that way.
Correct, that's correct.
Chat a little bit about the canopy on the Collect Air kit.
Okay, James, the canopy on the F-107, as some of you may know, is quite unusual. It's much like the F-84 canopy. That is, it rises vertically instead of hinging at the rear or the front or the side as many other airplanes. It literally goes up on its own little tramway. It raises up approximately 3 feet above the cockpit.
Right, and you can see that very clearly in the documentary, the USAF documentary
Yes.
on this DVD.
Correct. Collect Air gives you two options. They give you the fully vacuum-formed canopy, so you would be building a closed canopy version, which works fine. They also have the open canopy version, which has given me some problems. There's a very delicate metal casting for the cockpit frame into which you cut individual pieces of clear vacuum form. Unfortunately, in the molding process, Collect Air made the windows just slightly short of the frame.
Oh.
Yes, very, very depressing. So what I'm going to have to do, it's going to be almost like being a jeweler, is cut off the front of the metal frame and move it back like a 32nd of an inch and re-glue it to the rest of the metal frame. It's going to be neurosurgery modeling wise.
So your intent is to display this in a canopy open position
Yes.
where that minor variation really wouldn't be noticeable.
Yes, I like to do open canopies because it makes the airplane look so much busier. I scratch built already the mechanism, the raising mechanism for the canopy using my aforesaid references.
And it looks like that raising mechanism you created out of some simple styrene shapes from the model railroading section of the hobby shop.
Out of evergreen plastic shapes, that's correct. It's very easy to do as long as you've got the references to see what it looks like. I think there's no substitute for open cockpits, and if you go to practically any modeling get-together, the very best models will always have an open cockpit.
Phil, talk a little bit about what you're doing with the exhaust on this particular model.
Yes, I love the the intricate afterburning, the pedals that limit the thrust of the jet engine, and I wasn't satisfied with the representation Collect Air had done. It's okay, as I said before, from 2 feet away, looks fine, and the F100 exhaust from the monogram kit could also be used, which isn't bad. But I went to the F100 photo etch set for their that Edward produces, and has very fine exhaust pedals in it. And I assembled that and am going to use that in the tail end. It just makes things look much more complicated again in this F107 model.
Now, it strikes me that this is a technique you could apply to any plastic or resin jet model as well. This is not something limited to this F107.
Yes, modelers around the world trade off parts. I've often added exhaust from many other airplanes to other airplanes, and no one, unless you worked on the airplane, would ever know the difference. No one. I often use cockpits in Russian airplanes because the kit won't give you any. I'll get a black box cockpit or an Aries cockpit or another brand, and I'll adapt it, especially in MiGs. There is no one going to know, as opposed to they know everything about ME 109s and 190s, but when it comes to evil Empire birds, they don't know.
Phil, not all of us have the skills necessary to attack a full-on resin bird like this. So let's talk about a new kit that's on the market, the Trumpeter 1/72nd scale F107A.
Yes, our friends in the People's Republic of China came out with a very nice injected kit. They have learned their lessons very quickly. Their learning curve is very steep. It's a very nice kit. It's got everything that the modeler who doesn't want to take on what I call practice bleeding and doing these smaller production kits would want. The 107, I believe there's already some aftermarket for it. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it makes a very nice kit, and you can just forget about any other, for instance, the air model conversion. Just forget about it. Just go directly to the Trumpeter kit, and you'll have a nice version.
Now, this Trumpeter kit is available in two different boxings, the original Trumpeter boxing, and Trumpeter worked very closely with a Japanese firm called Monochrome in developing this kit. The Monochrome boxing is the same kit, it's the same plastic. The difference between the two is the decal set that comes with each. The Trumpeter boxing doesn't come with any of the very distinctive red markings that are on the F107 birds. The Monochrome kit, on the other hand, does have those markings in decal form. Unfortunately, they got them the wrong color. It's more of a medium orange color, which is very regrettable. So we're going to help you overcome that hurdle in just a little bit here. Phil, one of the most distinctive things about the F107A is the natural metal finish, or in this case, it's actually, from what I understand, a painted metal finish on most of the F107.
That's correct, James. Either way, though, whether it's natural metal or painted silver, it's critical, if the model is to look decent, that surface be pristine. And this isn't as hard as it looks. It requires time. Yes, if you're a shake and bake modeler, you may not want to do natural metal finishes. But I start out by using good old automotive gray lacquer primer, and I emphasize lacquer. It must say that on the can, either lacquer or lacquer based.
Are there any problems with that lacquer-based primer reacting with resin or plastic materials?
None. Oh well, the lacquer etches pure plastic. Yes, in fact, that's how it grabs mechanically at a microscopic level, grabs onto the plastic. It etches just a few atoms thick layer. Automobile primers are very forgiving. I use them from a spray can. I don't buy them, especially for airbrushes. And it's an art more than a science. I will spray sometimes maybe only 3 or 4 inches away from the model, but on the other hand, my hand is moving very fast with that spray
So the
can.
idea is to get a very light, thin layer of this automotive lacquer primer.
Well, light to medium layer, let's say, and then you let it dry, and then you start.
How long does it need to dry? Is
Oh
this...
well, lacquer primer. If you don't put it on very heavily, it'll be ready to sand in. My goodness, 10, 15 minutes, absolute maximum. It's ready to sand.
Now, Phil, let's talk about what to do after that initial primer pass. You've got your lacquer primer on, and we're looking for flaws in that initial finish.
That's correct, James. I then hold the object, the fuselage or the entire airframe, up to an incident light. It can be incandescent or fluorescent. And you look at it at about a 20-degree angle, and it will very quickly reveal any surface discrepancies, even the smallest ones. I then use my 3M blue acryl body putty meant for real cars, but I use it sparingly. I like it because it's so easily sandable and fine-grained and quick drying. You go all over your model and you put little dabs of the putty, not thick, very thin because it'll dry very fast. Put little dabs all over. Once it dries, wet sand, you can use 400 paper, maybe go up to 600 paper for the initial wet sanding. Then, again, quickly reprime with a fairly dry coat. I should mention, you don't want to prime too heavily or you will fill up very petite engraving. And then you'll end up having to rescribe, which you do not want to do. Well, you keep doing iterations of this, sanding, primering, puttying, sanding, and looking at the light all the time. And finally, you'll whittle it down. There will just be the tiniest little discrepancies. And at that point, I switched to micro mesh brand sanding. It starts at 3200 grit and you can go all the way to 12,000.
That should be available at any good hobby shop.
Micro mesh are available at most hobby shops. That's correct. They're not inexpensive, but they're well worth having. They last forever. I have found that with flat automotive lacquer primer, that once you get up to the 8,000 grit range, the primer, miracle of miracles, will start to be glossy. It'll actually get to be a glossy finish. You don't have to polish, as so many modelers say, oh, I polished it before I shot the final silver coat. You don't have to do that with this. You just use 8,000, and if you want to, go to 12,000, and it'll be plenty glossy for you. And once again, that gloss will also show any last-minute surface irregularities which you can fix.
Phil, once we have a good, solid, primed, pristine finish, how do we get that stunning metal finish?
Well, there are different brands of natural metal finishing medium out there, but I have come to far prefer the Alclad line of natural metal finishes. I bought 6 bottles of it many years ago at the Albuquerque Nationals and was stunned by how easy it was to use. It was acetone based back then, but today it is lacquer based, so it's perfectly compatible with your lacquer primer, and it dries in a flash. And by in a flash, I mean it will be dry in 1 minute for a light to medium coat. It is extremely tough to masking media. You can mask it with anything, probably duct tape if you wanted, and it will not pull the finish up. Many modelers complain about other natural metal products lifting up when they mask it. You don't have to worry with Alclad. It's available in a large variety of shades, and what I like best is when you're doing heavy-duty masking, your fingers, by necessity, are all over the model. It's just what happens. Well, many other products There are very big warnings about touching it, and you might have to wait a day. Not with Alclad. You wait about 5 minutes, and you can touch it forever. There will never be any fingerprints, no smudges, no nothing. And since I do a lot of heavy-duty masking, that is perfect. I can handle the model at will, never worrying about marring the finish.
Now, Phil, one of the challenges in doing the F-107 will be getting the very distinctive red markings on the aircraft accurately.
Yes, that's correct. They do occupy a significant amount of the surface of the airframe, and that was the only version ever done. All 3 test airplanes were done in this vivid red paint scheme. At one time, many, many years ago, I would use whatever decals a kit gave me. And there were some kits, for instance, the Monogram F100 Thunderbirds, which gave you huge decals, which overlaid a large portion of the airframe. Well, that's difficult to apply, frankly. And I've come around in the last 10 years to totally masking airframes to do different colors. I particularly like the advent of the Tamiya yellow masking tape. I just haven't found any product that is as good as that. It will cut an exact line, paint will not seep under it, and I use it exclusively. I can cut it down to a 1/16 of an inch wide. I can mask the most difficult, varied areas with it. And you just have to remember to cover all the areas where you don't want overspray. And it's just like painting real cars, which I've been doing since I was 16 for a hobby. You've got to cover everything you don't want dust on.
Phil, one of the things that strikes me about the F-107A are the large number of stencils and other markings on the aircraft. It's one of the truly distinctive things of this particular prototype. Let's talk a little bit about some of your strategies for getting good decal application over natural and painted metal finishes.
Fine, James. I have found that I don't need to clear coat over decals when putting decals on top of Alclad. If you shoot the Alclad in a medium wet coat, it will dry glossy, and it will not need any other. You don't have to pre-shoot it with clear gloss, which actually can kill some of the brilliance of the metal. This has been brought up by many modelers. I personally decal directly over the silver, and unless I think the decal is really going to start flaking off soon, I'll just let it alone. If I am worried about the decal peeling, I might mask off the area and put a light coat of Future over it.
Phil, when you decal over a natural metal finish, are there any particular setting solutions or decal softening solutions that you like to use?
Yes, I have one favorite, and that's Solvacet. I've been using it for at least 30 years. Some modelers think it's a bit aggressive. In fact, when you put it over some decals, the decal will start to wrinkle, and you'll be horrified. You'll think you've ruined it. The only thing I can say is don't touch the decal. You'll be surprised. Overnight, or maybe even in an hour, that decal will flatten out like you can't believe. If you should get a tiny raised area in the decal, a bubble or something just very tiny, take a very sharp number 11 blade and pierce that bubble, just the tiniest little nick in the bubble, then go back over and reapply Solvacet, and it will take care of that in a flash. It'll flatten it right on down. Some people use Microsol. I don't think it's as aggressive as Solvacet. With today's very fine engraving, we really need something to make those decals lie down in those little tiny trenches.
Phil, how can we duplicate the stencils that cover the F-107A?
What I would recommend is going to any of recent fighter kits. Could be anything from an F-15 down to who knows. And some of the aftermarket sets will have many, many stencils. In fact, some of them are strictly stencils. They'll say stencils for such and such, an aircraft. Well, I often use stencils from other airplanes and put them on the model I'm doing. I put them in the correct location. It's just that they may not say what the real thing says. And I sometimes even use 1/72nd stencils on 1/48th aircraft. And people still don't
It's going to provide
notice.
a little additional
Yeah,
level of interest there.
I like the busyness that stencils add to an airframe, especially a natural aluminum airframe. Not so much for camo, but for natural aluminum. And these test airplanes, looking at my reference photos I took at Wright-Patterson, there are stencils all over these airplanes. And it really makes them busy in the same way that a raised cockpit makes the airplane look busy.
Now, it's worth noting here that it's really not that critical to get the accurate text on a stencil. At the scales we're talking about here, the stencil may not be readable.
That's correct. Unless you're one of these people goes around with magnifying glasses, well, I guess then you would look and see it wasn't correct. But nobody.
And we've
is
never
going
seen
to know.
those at a model
Oh
contest.
no,
before.
never seen one of those people. Never.
Phil, there's a number of books and other references out there that contain references to the F-107A. Why don't you talk a little bit about what's available?
Fine, James. My primary reference for this exciting airplane for the last 20 years has been the Aerophile magazine, the lamented passing of Aerophile, which was published out of San Antonio in 1978, had an article featuring the F-107, which had some of the greatest close-up shots and detail shots and drawings you could ever want in this airplane. Well, Aerophile has been out of business for many years, but not to give up on things, old reliable Steve Ginter recently published Air Force Legends number 203, which is about a quarter-inch thick monograph on the 107. And fortunately, Steve has incorporated practically everything from these other references into his book. And since the book is readily available, it's not cheap, goes for about $30, but this is the book I would want above any other. There was an Air Power article of many years ago in 1986, but I would forget all those. Just buy the Ginter book, and that's all you really need.
Between the Ginter book, which was written by William Simone, I should point out, and this DVD, you should have practically all the reference material you need to put together a very accurate, very intriguing model of the F-107.
The only better thing you could do would be to be standing next to the airplane taking pictures, perhaps, because there are many pictures in this you could not get. For instance, inside the cockpit, you're not going to get up to the cockpit in this airplane.
Unless, of course, they let you set up your workbench next to the airplane.
That's correct. This is the way to go, this book. Perhaps my years in the Air Force flying betray me, but there are certain airplanes that even today, in my opinion, look as good as anything out there that's been produced. Those two would have to be the B-58 and the subject of our talk today, the F-107. They are mean, purposeful, and sleek, and I just don't think you can do better than to build a model of this airplane.
Well, that brings us to the end of our Modeler's Notes discussion. Phil, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. We hope you enjoy this presentation, and we look forward to your feedback on it. If there are any particular subjects that you're interested in seeing Rocket.Aero cover for future DVD discs, please drop us an email. Again, thanks for your time.